User experience or UX-based design involves creating experiences that are positive for the user. We can apply this idea to the world of APIs and gain a positive outcome. Of course, in our world, developers are our users, so we can be more specific and describe developer experience. I work for Layer 7, CA Technologies company. I'm an API architect in Layer 7's API Academy. I was born in Toronto. I now live in London. And I'm totally kidding. We're not going to do 30 minutes of that. That would have been just, my God, right? Horrendous. Jeez. I mean, that was awful for me. I can't imagine what it was like for you. So there was a point to that. We're talking about experience. I imagine that was a bit uncomfortable for you, right? I'm kind of curious as to why it was uncomfortable. I imagine some of you might have felt empathy. I know Adam felt sorry for me. I could see it in his eyes. Ronnie, turn the mute off. You know, maybe some of you felt a bit apprehensive about 30 minutes of that. But why did you feel that way, right? If we think of presentations as a product, something we're delivering, something I'm giving to you, we can start to analyze what it is that caused that reaction in the room, right? At a certain level, we have a level of aesthetics, right? The appearance. I went out of my way to make this the most monstrously ugly presentation I could, right? I chose weird colors, lime green as a title. I don't know if you notice, text was kind of overflowing past where it should. I tried to find the most, generic Microsoft Office-y clip art I could. So altogether, it didn't look nice. I didn't deliver it very well. The way I spoke wasn't very strong. It wasn't confident. We can also look at it from an interaction perspective. Now, typically, presentations are delivered to you, but there's always some level of interaction. I'm scanning, right? I'm watching. You can speak to me with your eyes, but you couldn't when I had my back to you, right? There was no level of interaction. You were disconnected. And then lastly, there's this element of structure. I dove in and started talking about something. Then I backed up and talked about who I was. And slides were jumping all over the place. We had bullets, misaligned, paragraphs within bullets, right? All of this led to really a poor experience overall, right? None of us were happy, I don't imagine. Here's the interesting thing. The content? It's the same content I might have delivered in another way. But my guess is that none of you can actually remember what it is I was saying because it was so awful. The experience was so bad that the content is lost. Okay, 2 things to learn from that. Experience matters, right? The second thing to learn from that is if you're ever in a really bad presentation, go out of your way to try and understand what the person's saying because maybe there's some gems in there that you're missing, right? We can take this idea and apply it to the world of APIs as well, right? So let's look at an API scenario that involves experience. Suppose we're building a mobile application, and we want to add some type of weather forecasting capability, right? So I need to find out what the local weather is in whatever city the user's in. An API makes sense. We have that building block we can use. But when we go out to find a suitable API, we find that there's a bit of friction. I can't find the API that will do what I need to do exactly the way I want it. Or the terms don't match, right? Or there's something about it that doesn't make sense. So I'm a little bit unhappy. When I finally do find one, I find that it's really tough to get started. The registration process is difficult. Not insurmountable. It means that I have to wait a few hours. I actually have a project deadline, but it's okay. I can work on some other stuff while I wait for this to happen. When I finally get registered, I find out that the API uses something called XML RPC. I thought every API uses REST, something I call REST. What is REST? But this says XML RPC, and I don't even have an XML parser. It turns out I do, but it's just more time I'm spending, and I'm starting to get more frustrated. And finally, I find out all the temperatures in Fahrenheit, right? because it was written specifically for that audience, right? So in the end, I have a poor experience overall. The thing is, each of those small annoyances is not insurmountable, right? They're not unrecoverable. People can still get the weather forecast data. I can still convert Fahrenheit to Celsius. I can still eventually get registered. I can still learn how to use XML RPC. But they create a poor experience for the user. So this all matters because I would say this. Designing an API is easy. If I asked every single one of you to come up with a weather forecast API, I bet you could do it in 15 minutes, right? But if I asked you to design effective APIs, it would probably be a lot harder. An effective API being one that meets our design goals, our business goals, right? If we start with a business model and we want an API that will help us achieve those business goals, that's a lot harder, right? We often see business models depicted. Adam and John have that great chart. What I found is from a design perspective, 98% of the time it boils down to these two things ultimately. If we're talking about really open public APIs, we want more people using them. So it's about increasing adoption. If we're talking about a closed API system, we want to lower the cost, right? If we're talking about a partner systems, it's often both of these together. So some examples, if I want revenue from my API, I want more people using it. If I want to build mobile applications using my private API, I want those apps deployed faster and cheaper. The only way to achieve these goals, right, is to have that experience behind it. We do better with products that we enjoy using, right? This comes out of a lot of research and study, and it makes sense for APIs as well. The challenge for us as designers, when we sit down with that intimidating blank piece of paper to start designing our API, it really seems difficult because you have all these choices, and the challenge is you don't know if you make a wrong choice today, what the impact will be tomorrow, right? You're scared that if you choose the wrong message format, you'll alienate someone and you won't achieve those business goals that you wanted. So what I'm proposing is that if we start to take a UX and a user experience-based approach to this whole process, we can do better. We can become more successful as designers. We'll build better APIs, right? Simple as that. There's really 3 layers or flavors or streams of design, especially for APIs. This is not specific to APIs, but it's useful for us to look at. If we just start with functionality as a design idea, functionality helps us address these questions. What does the API actually do? Where is it located? How reliable is it? The pieces of the API, right? The actual guts. A good way to envision what functionality is to think about the SOA era, right? Now, this isn't true of all SOA projects, but kind of the stereotypical SOA project or SOA approach was one that was very functionality focused. SOA, services-oriented architecture, solved a problem where we had business operations happening, systems were trying to interconnect, but we didn't have those functions exposed. So we set about creating functionality, right? We focused on what things needed to happen, the activities, the actions. And part of that is we started turning everything within organizations into a service and started building service catalogs, gigantic service catalogs. Everything is a service. And the reality, at least in my experience, and I know for a lot of my colleagues, is for this to work, we had to make people use it, right? We had to have a CTO with a big stick who told everyone, you have to connect to that ESB. Or we had the owner of the customer information file, the database at the back end, exposing web service and turning off all other avenues to interact with the KIF. In these cases, a functional approach can make sense. What we're seeing now, though, of course, is a more of a usability focus. So in usability, we're asking how we actually use the API, right? How easy is it for me as a developer using your API to accomplish my own goals? How much of my own time do I need to commit? In a lot of ways, the web went through a revolution of 1.0 to 2.0, we could say that this era is the Web API 2.0 era because we're focusing on usability now. I think for a lot of people who've lived through both, if you ask them to differentiate between SOA and APIs, forget about technical definitions, they'll talk about things like this. We used to be very service-centric, and now we're more developer-centric. We care about users. The thing that becomes obvious, the examples that we put up in presentations tend to be product APIs, competitive APIs. And it's from those kind of markets that usability starts to foster. Right? We start to see actually caring about users because we're treating APIs like a product. But don't forget this. Usefulness still trumps usability, right? No matter how usable your product is, if it doesn't do anything that anyone wants, no one will care. But beyond this, we can talk about experience as a design factor. Experience really means how does the API make the developer feel, which is really crazy, right? We don't normally talk about things like this in our field, right? We talk about engineering and science and protocols, not feelings. Maybe a more concrete definition would be one like this. If we're talking specifically about developer experience, right, we can say, firstly, it's the sum of all interactions between the developer and you. So usability focuses on individual interactions, interacting with a product. Experience takes all of those interactions together. And what does it mean when you take them all together? What's the sum of the parts? And the second thing is, what's the emotive impact on the developer of all of that interaction? What's the end result? How does it make them feel? If we look at these interactions a little bit closer and within these definitions, we can see from a functionality perspective, we have this type of interaction. End user uses an application that uses an API. And rightfully, we focus a lot on this, right? This is the meat. We have to figure out how to make all that work. Usability adds another level of interaction to the picture. So we have developers finding APIs, learning how they work, right? And then building applications to use them. Also troubleshooting them, getting analytic data back. So suddenly a whole other sphere develops for usability. And then if we look at it from an experience perspective, we even have human interactions happening. Evangelists, support people. If you're a private API, the person you're sending to the company meetings to talk about integration. And ultimately, all of these interactions from an experience perspective result in some type of feeling, some type of experience for your user. So that's really what experience and interaction together are. Traditionally in product markets, they look at usability like this. I'm a designer. I develop a product, and then someone uses that product, right? I build a phone, I build software, I build a website, and then there's a human using that product. We have this unique challenge. We build computer software that other people build computer software to interact with, right? For the most part. Slightly different. Something we can learn from other design fields is that although it's a human building a product for a human, it's really still humans connecting, right? A designer builds an application for a human, but there's still an interaction in a sense, but it's abstracted, right? In our case, that's still true. Although we're building software for other people to build software with, we're still opening a line of communication to someone, but we're doing it through software, right? We're using software as the medium of interaction. So that's all a bit abstract, but let's get a bit more grounded here. So who are our users? Who are these people that we're interacting with? Are you familiar with personas? This is pretty popular in user experience, right? Let's create a persona that defines the type of user we're building a product for. And this is our persona for APIs, right? His name is Josh, and he blogs, he tweets, he codes, and he swears, right? So it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, stereotypical, t-shirt and jeans. He loves JavaScript, he hates XML. I would say, 9 times out of 10, this is what we're thinking about. But why are we always building APIs for Josh, right? Josh isn't necessarily your user. It's most frustrating when I work with a person building a private API in a large organization, and they're building for Josh. And there's like 3 Joshes in the whole company, right? And they forgot about Tony, right? Tony's been here 27 years and has lived through all of those successive generations of technology. And the scary thing is, he knows the back end that you're exposing better than you do, right? This is a unique type of user. And to ignore these differences is a huge mistake if you're building an API from a usability and experience perspective, right? You can't design for usability if you don't know who you're designing for. Tony and Josh have their own levels of familiarity, of comfort, of likes and dislikes. And we could take this a step further. We might bring in Brenda, who, doesn't care about APIs at all and just wants integration. We really need to understand our audience in order to be effective. So let's take a step back. A lot of this comes from human-computer interaction, right? This field of usability that's existed for a long time. It's existed for a very long time, going back all the way to the 50s, when we first started studying how humans interact with technology. Particularly interesting is the study of the mouse, right? The mouse started with Doug Engelbart coming up with the idea. Do you know Engelbart, who delivered the demo of all demos, or mother of all demos, where he invented everything that will ever be invented and showcased it? It's available on YouTube. It's worth watching. He and Bill English built this first mouse, but it wasn't mainstream, it wasn't popularized. A guy named Stuart Card, while working at Xerox, the other place where everything came from, started looking at pointing devices. And he was trying to determine which pointing device would work the best. The amazing part of the story is he was able to apply science to do this. So he's looking for which is the most usable device amongst things you'd put on your head, joysticks, something called the mouse that Engelbart and English had created. And he was able to apply something called Fitts' law to empirically determine which one is the best. Right? Fitts' law was created to identify how difficult it was to use your hand to get to things based on the distance of the target and the size of it. It wasn't invented for technology, but Card was able to apply it to this world and then empirically determine that the mouse was the best way of succeeding. That when I heard about that, when I read about that, that really hit me very strongly, because where is our Fitts' law in the API design space, right? In the usability space? Where is our science? Where is our solid foundation and grounding? Where's our measurability? What I'm worried about is that we're just kind of trying stuff, feeling around in the dark. Being an artist is wonderful, but I don't know if that's the most efficient way to go about things. I don't know if we should all be artists. So the good news is we have lots of usability and UX guidance, right? And a lot of that can actually be airlifted right into our world. So that's good. The other thing is we actually do have API usability theory, right? We kind of took this word API and made it ours. But people have been working on APIs for a long time. I think we're specifically talking about web APIs. Maybe eventually we'll just call this network APIs. I don't know, remote APIs. But API theory has been grounded in programming languages for a long time, right? The Java API, the C API, the Direct 3D API. If you've never watched Joshua Bloch's talk on what good API design is and why it matters, watch it. Essentially, he goes through API usability and describes it in simple principles, right? But again, the challenge is it doesn't directly correlate to our network API world. More academic but interesting is this. A guy from Microsoft, Stephen Clark, I think about 10 or 11 years ago, published a paper called Describing and Measuring API Usability with Cognitive Dimensions. And then he starts laying out these dimensions. So really insane, right? Cognitive dimensions is specific to the world of visual programming and describes a way of categorizing and measuring how developers interact with their developer tooling. Right? This sounds interesting. This sounds possibly applicable. Again, though, the small gap is that what he's describing is specific to these local APIs, these APIs constrained by a language. He was talking about .NET APIs, but it's a useful model. Because if we can start to adopt this type of thinking, we can actually start to measure APIs for usability. We can actually start to get a better grasp of how to make them better, right? What I'm trying to do right now, and this is definitely a work in progress, is start to pull out these categories, right? What are the aspects of usability that are useful and measurable for us? And I'll quickly go through a few of these. You know, task invocation ratio. How many calls does a developer have to make to accomplish the task he's trying to achieve? What does the structure of your request and response look like? How deep do they have to go to get the data they want? How much noise is there? How much data is there that they don't need to accomplish their tasks? How easy is it for them to move between responses or to find the specific data they want? A more abstract one. How much additional tooling and libraries does a developer need to install in order to use your API, right? How long does it take them to get to the first call? And then what are the nature of the errors that happen, right? Are they your fault? Are they the developer's fault? How difficult is it to fix? Where are they happening? What is the vocabulary that needs to be learned? So we could go on and on. And then that, combined with the idea of experience, allows us to start identifying what types of experiences matter from a developer perspective, right, when using an API. So if we start putting this together, what I'm saying is we can take a persona, take some measurable usability factors, and start determining the type of experience that that developer is going to have, right? And then if we map those experiences to our business drivers, our design goals, we can actually achieve something quite interesting. From a methodology perspective, it means you start by deciding what you're trying to do first, right? It's not about just opening an API and seeing what happens. It's about saying, here's what we're trying to do. Here's what it means from a design perspective. These are the goals and constraints that we establish based on that business goal. Then we identify who we're building this for. And then we start defining interactions. And then finally, after doing all of that, we design the API. So we don't start by designing the API. We start by establishing, who we're designing it for, why we're designing it, what the constraints are, what the interactions are, before we even sit down. And if we want to zoom into the design stage, if we want to measure usability and experience, we need to take this type of approach, right? Prototype, observe, and iterate. You don't launch an API into production and then see what people think. And we've got great prototyping tools out there now, right? Apiary, SOAP UI is very useful as a prototyping tool as well. Or just scripting. If you're building a Java or .NET or Ruby on Rails API, it doesn't matter. That doesn't have to be what you build your prototype on. When you prototype, just build the interface. However is quickest and easiest and allows you to iterate quickly so that you can take observations and change the API based on them. So one thing I wanted to mention, DX is not a feature. What I mean by this is, I think there's a danger that developer experience could become buzzword worthy, and we'll start to see everyone start to stamp APIs with DX or sell you products that say DX ready. Yeah, probably we will too. Why not? But DX is really about having a goal and caring about the experience, right? Maybe it's about even having empathy for your users, caring about how they feel. Ultimately, it's understanding your audience that's the key to this. You really have to know them. So if that means you have to start going to conferences that they go to instead of API conferences, that's what you should do, right? If you're primarily targeting mobile devs, go out and meet mobile developers. If you're targeting organizations within your enterprise, go meet with them. Find out what their challenges are and how they feel. This is the key, right? Designing for APIs is about designing for people. It's not about designing for machines, right? The applications that are built are going to be built by people. We have to start caring about their experiences. And if you do this, you can actually achieve something great. All right, thank you. So just before we go to questions, I wanted to quickly, I didn't want to do this at the start during the bad presentation part because it would have been bad, right? But I work for this company, Layer 7. We make API management products. So this stuff that helps you build all this DX and runtime interaction. If you want to see more meat, there's a demo tomorrow being run by Aaron White in this room at 10:50. Not this room, but whatever that says. All right? All right. Any questions?
So I guess most people have toyed around with hypermedia APIs and stuff, and we are starting to think about them as graphs with nodes in the graph. And I was wondering if you could see a usage for Fitts law as a distance measurement within the graph, so to speak.
So I'm definitely not a Fitts law expert. Maybe. I would love to see a presentation on that, if you could come up with it. I mean, I guess so. You mentioned hypermedia. I wanted to talk about hypermedia, actually, so I'm going to answer a different question. How about that? When I talked about designing for people, hypermedia brings something interesting, because in hypermedia, you might be designing for a content type. So what we usually do is develop APIs today for people to use tomorrow, right? They build an application tomorrow to use our API today. With hypermedia, you can be in an interesting situation where you're developing an API today for an application someone built yesterday, because you're conforming to a content type. In that case, this whole DX idea gets a little bit more interesting, right? Because then we're no longer actually building for DX, so are we building MX then, machine experience? I'm not sure. But ultimately, you're still going to build for future users. In terms of Fitts law and graph theory, I'll try and connect you with someone who has the mathematical brains to be able to help you with that. Sorry. Okay, anyone else? No? All right, thank you.